Hey, I see there's another safety meeting today. You know, I never paid any attention to those things. Hey, what's today's topic? Ooh, confined space entry. Ain't no sweat. Oxygen-deficient environments, permits, lockout and tagout, IDLH, just got it all down pat. I guess you could say I've got some experience with confined spaces. Yeah, the ultimate confined space.
Permit-required confined space entry is a subject not to be taken lightly. It is serious business. Lives are at stake. A confined space accident usually makes front-page headlines. The ironic part is these tragedies can be prevented by following proper permit-required confined space entry procedures and using one's common sense. In this video presentation, we will cover what constitutes a permit-required confined space, the hazards associated with permit-required confined space entry, proper pre-entry procedures, including completing the permit, attendant responsibilities, and a special section dealing with emergency rescue procedures. Confined space refers to a space that is large enough and so configured that an employee can enter and perform assigned work, and has limited or restricted means for entry or exit, and is not designed for continuous employee occupancy. It is important to note, sticking any part of your body inside an opening just to check things out is considered entry. A permit-required confined space is a confined space that also has one or more of the following characteristics. It contains or has the potential to contain a hazardous atmosphere, contains material that has the potential for engulfment, has an internal configuration such that an entrant could be trapped or asphyxiated by inwardly converging walls, or a floor which slopes and tapers to a smaller cross-section, or contains any other recognized serious safety or health hazard. Permit-required confined spaces commonly found in the work environment include, but are not limited to, storage tanks, pump wet wells, utility vaults, sludge digestion tanks, manholes, sewers, lift stations, tank trucks, and trenches, all of which could contain unacceptable atmospheric hazards due to poor natural ventilation or generated from the work being performed. All permit-required confined spaces in your work environment should be identified by sign, placard, or other effective means to prevent unauthorized entry. If there is any doubt on your part whether something at your facility qualifies as a permit-required confined space, check with your immediate supervisor or safety professional. Permit-required confined spaces may contain many potential hazards. These hazards can be categorized to include oxygen-deficient or enriched atmospheres, flammable or explosive atmospheres, toxic atmospheres, physical hazards generated by temperature extremes, radiation, excessive moisture, obstructions, noise, electricity, and chemical hazards that may harm the skin or eyes. It's important to understand that the majority of fatalities are caused by the simple lack of oxygen or asphyxiation. Without proper respect and appropriate precautionary measures, these potential hazards may cause falls, burns, electrocution, asphyxiation, poisoning, engulfment, heat stress, hearing loss, bodily injury, illness, and death. Inhaling toxic vapors is the second leading cause of deaths. This diagram demonstrates how vapors can quickly enter your bloodstream through your lungs. This is why you should never stick your head inside a confined space just to check things out, even momentarily, without first testing the air with monitoring devices. Some work activities, such as welding, can create toxic atmospheres in confined spaces. Other confined spaces may have mechanical moving parts that could cause serious injuries if not locked out and tagged. Engulfment can happen immediately and result in death, as shown here. It is important to identify and evaluate all potential hazards and follow all necessary precautions to eliminate or control them. Whether you're entering a permit-required confined space to perform maintenance work, repairs, inspections, or even new construction, the first step is to obtain an entry permit. A permit is required for every entry into a permit-required confined space. The permit serves as a valuable checklist to make sure necessary safety precautions are followed to protect you against the identified hazards. An entry permit should contain the following information: the date, location, and reason for entry into the permit-required confined space, and the length of time for which the permit is valid. All entries should be made for a specific purpose, such as repair, maintenance, or inspection, and only if the tasks cannot be accomplished another way. If completion of the tasks being performed exceeds the time period for which the permit is valid, all work must be stopped and a new permit must be obtained to complete the job. Changing conditions and leaving the space unattended for long periods may also require a new permit. The permit will state the hazardous materials and the potential environmental hazards that may be encountered in the permit-required confined space. These hazards may include flammables or toxic vapors, dust, mist, oxygen-deficient or enriched environments, physical hazards, or more. It is important to know which hazards require monitoring, neutralization, and personal protection, and which require guarding. Of course, attempts should always be made to eliminate these hazards when possible. The type of atmospheric tests required and the results of these tests. Air monitoring informs you whether the atmosphere in the permit-required confined space is within acceptable levels, or if additional precautions are necessary, or if the space may be entered at all. The tests should be conducted by a person who has been properly trained and has made sure all testing instruments have been properly calibrated. The permit-required confined space should be tested prior to entry. Test the atmosphere at different levels. Some gases and vapors are heavier or lighter than air and can cause a high concentration and greater potential hazard at different levels of the confined space. Test outside the confined space to make sure the surrounding air is not contaminated. If test results indicate unacceptable environmental conditions, the entry is prohibited until such conditions are brought into acceptable limits. This may be accomplished by purging, cleaning, and/or ventilating the space. Most hazardous environments in a permit-required confined space are a result of poor ventilation. Certain tasks, such as welding, drilling, or even removing sludge, for example, could change the atmospheric conditions. Under these situations, air monitoring should be conducted on a continuous basis throughout the entry. A list of safety precautions required to perform the job. This could include cleaning and ventilating, necessary isolation, or lockout and tagout procedures, hot work permits. As mentioned earlier, ventilating by a blower or fan may be necessary to remove harmful gases and vapors. There are several methods for ventilating a confined space. The method and equipment you use will depend on the size of the confined space and contaminants associated with it. Blanking, locking out, and tagging all supply lines and sources of energy are needed to neutralize additional hazards. This is called isolating the space. This includes locking out and tagging electrical power as close to the source as possible, blocking and bleeding all chemical, pneumatic, and hydraulic lines, disconnecting belt and chain drives and mechanical linkages on shaft-driven equipment where possible. Once you have properly locked out and tagged the sources, try the start buttons, on-off switches, and other appropriate means to make sure you have properly isolated the source. Tasks that cause sparks, flames, heat, or other sources of ignition, such as welding or grinding, will require additional protective measures to ensure your safety. A list of safety and personal protective equipment required to perform the entry job duties in the permit-required confined space. Personal protective equipment is required and used when a hazard cannot be eliminated. The selection and type of protective equipment depends upon the hazard and tasks being performed. Certain tasks may contaminate the work environment with dust, fumes, mist, gases, vapors, or combinations of these. The effects of these concentrations may vary from a nuisance or bad odor to extremely dangerous. Many materials may reach dangerous levels, and still not be detected by your sense of smell. Respiratory protection must be properly selected and used to protect your health against airborne hazards. In addition to respirators, personal protective equipment which may be required to perform the job include hard hats when the potential for falling objects, both within the confined space and through the entryway, are present, or when the structures and equipment present a bump hazard. Eye and face protection, such as safety glasses, chemical goggles, or face shields, should be worn to guard against irritant dusts, vapors, chemical splashes, abrasive particles, and flying objects. Gloves to prevent cuts and scrapes. They provide protection from chemicals such as acids and solvents, physical protection from heat and cold, and to increase gripping ability when handling slippery materials and tools. Foot protection to guard against physical hazards such as falling objects and rolling equipment, chemical hazards, and slippery surfaces. Protective clothing to protect against extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, and protect against chemicals. Hearing protection to guard against excessive noise. Other safety equipment includes safety belts and harnesses, lifelines, life jackets, safety nets, fire extinguishers, fall protection, and escape systems. Always check with your supervisor if you have questions concerning personal protection equipment. Certain environments may warrant the use of low voltage or explosion-proof lighting. Barricades, signs, and other devices should be used to warn others from coming near the permit-required confined space. They should be placed in appropriate locations whenever there is a likelihood of a release of harmful gases, an exposed area that someone could fall into, or any other potential hazards that could affect workers or bystanders. The type of equipment which will be necessary for a rescue and how aid will be summoned in the event of an emergency. The permit lists equipment necessary for emergency rescues as well as the means for summoning aid. This will be covered in further detail in the rescue procedure section. An approval authority for the adequacy of the contents of the permit. This must be signed by an entry supervisor authorizing the entry and validating the accuracy of the information stated on the permit. The person shall also assure that all pre-entry requirements have been completed. Other information on the permit includes the communication procedures used by the authorized entrants and attendants to maintain contact during the entry, and the names of the entrant and attendant personnel. An attendant must be stationed outside the permit-required confined space to act as an observer of the workers within the confined space. He must be able to keep in constant communication with them. The attendant will know the procedures in the emergency action plan, how to use the retrieval and communication equipment, the procedures for summoning emergency rescue aid, and how to recognize signs of intoxication caused by overexposure to contaminants in the space. As mentioned earlier, the attendant must remain outside the permit-required confined space at all times and remain in continuous contact with all workers in the space. This can be by way of voice, radio, visual observation, or by any other equally effective means. The attendant has the authority and responsibility to order all workers to exit the permit-required confined space at the first recognition of intoxicated behavior, or if conditions or contamination levels in the confined space reach unsafe levels. The attendant is responsible for summoning emergency assistance. He should inspect all rescue equipment at the site of the permit-required confined space entry to make sure it is in proper working order, as well as to verify that the chosen means of communications for summoning help is functioning properly. The attendant is to remain at his or her post at all times, never leaving except to save their own life, or unless replaced by an equally qualified individual while the entry continues. If the attendant must leave and there is no replacement, all workers in the permit-required confined space must exit. Over half of all the deaths related to confined spaces is the person rushing in attempting to rescue someone, unplanned, unprepared, and unprotected. Don't let your emotions control your actions. Unplanned rescue, such as when someone instinctively rushes in to help a downed coworker, can easily result in a double fatality, or even multiple fatalities if there is more than one would-be rescuer. Each location must have a written emergency response plan. Off-site emergency response personnel may be used, provided they are capable of performing a rescue, are familiar with the premises, and may respond in a timely manner, usually within a few minutes. All rescuers must be trained in and follow established emergency procedures. This would normally consist of a review of all the different types of confined spaces which will be entered, their associated hazards, and what steps and equipment it will take to get someone out so they can receive proper medical attention. Emergency rescue teams should at regular intervals practice removing simulated victims such as dummies, mannequins, or real people through openings similar to those they would encounter in an actual rescue. When contaminated atmospheres are present, each rescue worker must use the correct respiratory protection, most often a self-contained breathing apparatus. Entry into unknown or IDLH atmospheres must be made wearing a self-contained breathing apparatus. All emergency rescue personnel must be trained and drilled on the use of additional emergency rescue equipment such as hoists, retractable lifelines, first aid, and communication equipment. At least one member of each rescue team must hold current certification in both basic first aid and CPR. Emergency rescue is a serious business. It should be well planned and executed only by specially trained individuals. An attendant should never enter the permit-required confined space to attempt a rescue. When emotions control actions, death is often the end result. Permits, safety equipment, detailed procedures, training. They are all part of safe permit-required confined space entry. They keep you out of the ultimate confined space and ensure your safety, only if you take advantage of them.
On July 5th, a worker entered a chemical degreaser tank to clean the bottom and collapsed shortly afterward. Two fellow workers noticed the man down and went to rescue him. All three workers died. On February 6th, two men at a wastewater treatment plant were working on a digester that was being drained. They went on top of the digester and opened a hatch to check the sludge level. To provide light in the confined space, they lowered an extension cord with an exposed 200-watt light bulb into the digester. The bulb broke and caused methane gas in the digester to explode, killing both men instantly. On October 10th, a self-employed plumbing contractor entered an underground water line vault to inspect a backflow device. The contractor collapsed shortly after entering the vault. A supervisor noticed the man down and entered the vault in a rescue attempt. Both men had entered an untested oxygen-deficient atmosphere and died as a result. All of these deaths could have been avoided if the procedures presented in this program had been followed.
That last one was about me. Don't let it be about you.